The colonel's laugh echoed through his office like a death sentence. Elena Vasquez had endured his accusations of malingering, his dismissal of her medical needs, his assumption that she was gaming the system. But when the 28-year-old intelligence specialist made a decision that would expose the truth hidden beneath her uniform, one question would haunt Fort Carson forever. How had 47 pieces of shrapnel from a Hellman IED blast created the military's most powerful advocate for invisible wounds? Captain Elena Vasquez stood at attention in the crisp morning air of Fort Carson. Her uniform pressed to perfection despite the early hour. At 28, she had already earned respect among her peers as a dedicated intelligence specialist. But today felt different. Today she was reporting to Colonel James Harrison, a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. The colonel's office was exactly what Elena expected. Medals lined the walls. Photographs of military ceremonies covered his desk, and the American flag stood proudly in the corner. Colonel Harrison himself was an imposing figure standing 6 feet 1 inch tall, with graying brown hair and piercing steel blue eyes that seemed to see through everything and everyone. "Captain Vasquez," he said without looking up from the papers on his desk. "I've been reviewing your file. Impressive record, but I noticed you've been requesting additional medical leave. Care to explain?" Elena's heart began to race. She had hoped this conversation wouldn't come so soon, but she knew it was inevitable. The recent headaches, the dizzy spells, the moments when sounds seemed too loud and lights too bright, they were becoming harder to hide. "Sir, I've been experiencing some health issues that require regular medical attention," she replied, keeping her voice steady and professional. Colonel Harrison finally looked up, his expression skeptical. "Health issues? You're 28 years old, Captain. What kind of health issues could a young soldier like you possibly have that require so much medical attention?" The way he said it made Elena's stomach turn. She could hear the disbelief in his voice, the assumption that she was somehow trying to avoid her duties. It was a tone she had encountered before, but never from someone so high in the chain of command. "Sir, I prefer not to discuss the specific details, but I assure you that my medical needs are legitimate and documented by the base medical staff," Elena said, maintaining her composure despite feeling increasingly uncomfortable. Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair, his steel blue eyes narrowing slightly. "Captain, I've been in the military for 32 years. I've seen soldiers try every excuse in the book to get out of their responsibilities. Young people today seem to think they can claim some mysterious ailment and get special treatment." Elena felt a flash of anger, but suppressed it quickly. "Sir, with all due respect, this is not an excuse. I take my duties seriously and have never shirked my responsibilities." "Is that so?" the colonel said, picking up her file again. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're trying to game the system. What's next, Captain? Are you going to tell me you have some invisible injury from your time overseas?" The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She had indeed served overseas in Afghanistan, but she had never spoken about what happened there. The official reports were classified, and she had been instructed to keep the details confidential. Very few people knew the full story of her deployment. "Sir, I completed my overseas deployment with distinction," she said, her voice beginning to show strain. Colonel Harrison stood up and walked around his desk, stopping just a few feet from Elena. "Let me tell you something, Captain. I've seen real soldiers with real injuries. I've seen men and women who've sacrificed everything for this country, and I could spot a malingerer from a mile away." Elena's hands began to tremble slightly, but she kept them clasped behind her back. The colonel's words were not just dismissive. They were insulting everything she had been through, everything she had sacrificed. "I understand your concern, sir, but I assure you that my medical needs are genuine," she repeated, though her voice was becoming quieter. "Genuine?" Colonel Harrison laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the small office. "Captain, you look perfectly healthy to me. You stand straight. You speak clearly. You show no obvious signs of any serious medical condition. What am I supposed to believe? That you have some secret injury that only appears when it's convenient for you?" The laugh was what broke something inside Elena. It wasn't just skeptical. It was cruel. It dismissed not only her current struggles, but also the very real trauma she carried from her service. She had been trying so hard to be professional, to handle the situation with dignity. But the colonel's attitude was making it impossible. As the colonel continued his lecture about duty and responsibility, Elena made a decision that would change everything. She could continue to suffer in silence, accepting his dismissal and ridicule, or she could show him the truth that she had been trying so hard to keep hidden. Elena took a deep breath and made a decision that would change the entire dynamic of the conversation. Her hands moved to the collar of her uniform, and she began to unbutton it with deliberate, measured movements. Colonel Harrison's expression shifted from smugness to confusion as he watched her actions. "Captain, what exactly do you think you're doing?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of alarm. "Sir, you said appearances can be deceiving," Elena replied, her voice now steady with resolve. "You want to see proof of my medical condition? I'm going to show you." As she opened her uniform shirt, the colonel's steel blue eyes widened in shock. Across Elena's chest and shoulder were a series of raised, twisted scars, the unmistakable marks of shrapnel wounds. The scars were extensive, creating a pattern that spoke of violence and survival. Some were small, like tiny craters in her skin, while others were longer, jagged lines that told the story of metal fragments that had torn through flesh and muscle. The silence in the room was deafening. Colonel Harrison's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The confident, dismissive expression on his face disappeared completely, replaced by something that looked like horror and shame. "These are from an IED explosion in Helmand Province," Elena said quietly, her voice now completely calm. 4 years ago, my convoy was attacked while we were delivering intelligence equipment to a remote outpost. The blast killed 3 of my fellow soldiers and left me with 47 pieces of shrapnel in my body. She turned slightly, revealing more scars along her side and back. Each mark was a testament to a moment when her world had exploded into chaos, fire, and screaming metal. The colonel stared in stunned silence. His earlier arrogance completely evaporated. The medical team was able to remove most of the fragments, Elena continued, but several pieces were too close to vital organs to extract safely. They remain in my body, and sometimes they shift. When they do, I experience severe headaches, dizziness, and sometimes temporary hearing loss. Colonel Harrison finally found his voice, though it was barely a whisper. "Captain, I had no idea." "No, sir, you didn't," Elena replied, beginning to button her shirt back up. "Because I don't talk about it. Because I don't use it as an excuse. Because I continue to serve despite the pain. Because this is what I chose to do with my life." The colonel's face had gone pale. He looked down at the papers on his desk, then back at Elena, as if seeing her for the first time. The transformation was remarkable. The man who had been so confident in his judgments just moments before now looked lost and uncertain. "The doctors at Walter Reed told me that I was lucky to survive," Elena said, her voice becoming stronger. "They told me that most people with injuries like mine don't make it off the battlefield, but I did. And when I recovered enough to return to duty, I chose to come back because I believe in serving my country." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the room. "The medical appointments you questioned are necessary to monitor the remaining fragments. Sometimes they shift, and when they do, it can be dangerous. The doctors need to track their movement to ensure they don't migrate to more critical areas." Colonel Harrison stood up slowly, his movements uncertain. He walked to the window and stared out at the base, his hands clasped behind his back. Elena could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he carried himself differently now than he had just minutes before. "Captain Vasquez," he said finally, not turning around. "Why didn't you tell me this from the beginning?" "Sir, my medical information is private. I didn't feel it was necessary to share the details of my injuries to justify legitimate medical appointments. Additionally, much of what happened during that deployment is classified, and I was instructed to limit discussion of the specifics." The colonel turned back to face her, and Elena could see that his entire demeanor had changed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. "I owe you an apology, Captain. A profound apology." Elena remained at attention, though her posture had relaxed slightly. "Sir, I understand that you were concerned about soldiers potentially abusing the medical system. That's a legitimate concern for a commanding officer." "No," Colonel Harrison said firmly, shaking his head. "There's no excuse for what I just did." The first change came within days. Colonel Harrison personally visited the base medical facility to meet with the doctors and nurses who treated soldiers with service-connected conditions. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the chief medical officer, later told Elena that it was one of the most productive conversations she had ever had with a commanding officer. The colonel asked detailed questions about invisible injuries, DR. Martinez explained during one of Elena's routine appointments. He wanted to understand everything from traumatic brain injuries to chronic pain conditions to PTSD. He took notes like he was studying for a final exam. Martinez checked the latest scan showing the location of the shrapnel fragments still in Elena's body. He also asked specifically about your case, Captain Vasquez. He wanted to understand exactly what you deal with on a daily basis so he could better support you and others in similar situations. Elena felt a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. While she appreciated the colonel's efforts, she still wasn't entirely comfortable being the center of so much attention. "I just hope this helps other soldiers, ma'am." "Oh, it already has," Martinez assured her. "We've had 5 soldiers come in this week for appointments they had been putting off because they were afraid of how their commanders would react. Word is getting around that Colonel Harrison is genuinely supportive of soldiers seeking medical care." As the weeks passed, the mandatory training sessions that Colonel Harrison had promised became a reality. Elena was asked to participate as a guest speaker, sharing her story with officers and senior NCOs from across the base. The first session was terrifying. Standing in front of a room full of senior military personnel and talking about her injuries felt like exposing her deepest vulnerabilities, but the response was overwhelmingly positive. Major Jessica Torres, a company commander, approached Elena after the presentation with tears in her eyes. "Captain, I owe you an apology. I have a soldier in my unit who's been requesting frequent medical appointments, and I've been giving her a hard time about it. After hearing your story, I realize I may have been making her situation much worse." Captain Anthony Garcia, a veteran of multiple deployments, shared his own struggles with hearing loss from repeated exposure to explosions. "I've been denying that I have a problem for years," he admitted. "But listening to you talk about facing your injuries head-on has made me realize that I need to get help." The training sessions became so popular that Colonel Harrison expanded them to include enlisted personnel at all levels. Elena found herself becoming an unofficial advocate for soldiers with invisible injuries, a role she had never expected but found deeply fulfilling. One afternoon, a young private named David Kim approached her after a training session. He was barely 19, fresh out of basic training, but there was something in his eyes that looked much older. "Captain Vasquez," he said quietly, "I was in a convoy that hit an IED during my first deployment. I wasn't physically injured, but ever since then, I've been having nightmares and panic attacks. I've been too scared to tell anyone because I didn't want them to think I was weak." Elena sat down with Private Kim and spent an hour talking to him about PTSD, about the importance of seeking help, and about the fact that invisible wounds were just as real and deserving of treatment as physical ones. By the end of their conversation, he had agreed to make an appointment with the base mental health services. "Thank you, Captain," he said as he prepared to leave. "I feel like I can breathe again for the first time in months." Meanwhile, Colonel Harrison was undergoing his own transformation. He began making regular visits to the medical facility, not to check up on soldiers, but to learn more about their conditions and needs. He established an open-door policy specifically for soldiers dealing with medical issues, and he made it clear that seeking medical care would never be held against anyone in their performance evaluations. One day, Colonel Harrison called Elena into his office again. This time the atmosphere was completely different, warm and supportive rather than hostile and suspicious. "Captain Vasquez, I have some good news," he said with a smile. Your application for the Command and General Staff College has been approved. Congratulations. Elena felt her heart race with excitement. Thank you, sir. I am honored. You've earned it, the colonel replied. Your leadership during this entire process has been exemplary. You've turned a difficult situation into an opportunity to help your fellow soldiers. And that's exactly the kind of officer the Army needs. As Elena's departure for Staff College approached, the changes she had helped initiate at Fort Carson began to take on a life of their own. What had started as one colonel's awakening had grown into a base-wide transformation in how service-connected medical conditions were understood and supported. Colonel Harrison, Captain Vasquez, General Hayes began her tone serious but not unfriendly. I've been hearing remarkable things about the initiatives you've implemented regarding support for soldiers with service-connected medical conditions. Ma'am, the credit really belongs to Captain Vasquez, Colonel Harrison said. Her courage in sharing her story opened my eyes to problems I didn't even know existed. Elena felt a mixture of pride and nervousness. She had never intended for her personal situation to become a model for other military installations, but she was gratified to know that other soldiers might benefit from what had happened. General Hayes, Colonel Harrison said, I believe this program could be implemented Army-wide. The training materials we've developed could be easily adapted for other commands. 2 years later, Major Elena Vasquez stood in a conference room at the Pentagon addressing a group of senior military officials from all branches of the armed forces. The room was filled with generals, admirals, and senior civilians from the Department of Defense, all gathered to hear about the success of the Invisible Wounds initiative that she and Colonel Harrison had developed. The program had exceeded every expectation. Ladies and gentlemen, Elena began her voice confident and clear. When we started this program at Fort Carson, we had one simple goal: to create an environment where soldiers felt safe seeking the medical care they needed. Today, I'm pleased to report that we've achieved that goal and much more. As Elena concluded her presentation and looked out at the faces of senior military leaders who were now committed to supporting soldiers with invisible wounds, she touched her chest, where beneath her dress uniform, the scars from that IED explosion remained.